Take the horse.
All right, First Sergeant, if you would take over.
Company, shoulder, arm. Standing word today, gentlemen. President Fowl. Company dismissed.
Arg!
Ladies and gentlemen, just a quick note about the 67th New York, which is the regiment that we portray. They were a regiment that actually fought in the Civil War. They were formed in Brooklyn in 1861. At the time, Brooklyn was considered part of Long Island, so they were also referred to as the 1st Long Island Volunteers. The 67th New York was part of the Army of the Potomac, which was the main army in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. The soldiers of the 67th New York enlisted for 3 years. So they started in July of 1861. Their enlistment was up in July of 1864. As a matter of fact, July 4th of 1864. Most of the soldiers that had made it to that point in the 67th re-enlisted. But at that point, because of casualties and disease and a lot of other reasons, they did not have many soldiers left. So they, at that point, what was left of them and the ones that re-enlisted formed with another New York regiment, the 65th, and they went under the 65th's name or title, if you will, for the remainder of the war. Each one of us is very fortunate to take on the name of an actual soldier in the 67th. My name is Rich Coleman. I am the president of the association. I have the honor of representing a soldier that shares my same last name. I'm not related to him, but his name was Jacob Coleman. Sergeant here, Bill Honehurst, he has taken on the name of a soldier, Will Atkins. Okay, each one of them. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, do you guys keep track on any of the descendants?
We can try to we can do research on that. I know Bill has done some research on his soldier. There's not a lot really out there for him. Just there's records. Some of us, like Scott McKendrick over there, and myself, actually have traced our ancestry back to my ancestor fought with the 82nd Pennsylvania. His name was Thomas R. Love. He was an Irishman. I'm an Irish descent. So he was out of the ranks a lot. They don't really say why, but he was, in his records, they list him as a painter in camp. So typically they didn't trust him with a rifle, they trusted him with a paintbrush. So you can guess what he might have been doing. The 67th was, as I said, fought in most of the campaigns, including Gettysburg. They were part of the 6th Army Corps. If any of you know anything about the way the Army is made up, it's made up of corps, which are made up of divisions. Well, I should start at the bottom. A regiment, like the 67th New York, at full strength is 1,000 men. Company K, which is what we represent, would be 100 men. There'd be 10 companies, makes 1,000. 3 regiments would make a brigade, it would be about 3,000 men. 3 brigades make a division, 3 or 4, you can do the math, and then a division, there's 3 divisions make up a corps. The 67th was part of the 6th Army Corps, okay? So now you might notice, some of you might notice this cross on my chest here. You might think that means I'm a doctor or a medic. It does not, okay? The gentleman that was in command of the Army of the Potomac before Gettysburg was a gentleman named Joseph Hooker, okay? At the time he took command, morale in the Army was very bad. So he devised a system where each corps was given a corps badge, okay, to not only identify them, but also give them a sense of pride, okay? And as I said, 3 divisions made up a corps. The 3 divisions would be colorized by the red, white, and blue. Red number 1, white number 2, blue number 3. The 67th was part of the 3rd division of the 6th Corps, so we got the Maltese Cross, which was for the 6th Corps, and blue signified that we were in the 3rd Division. So the soldiers took that very seriously as a source of pride. They would put them on their coats, on their hats, anywhere to let everyone else know who they were a part of. The 6th Army Corps was not very involved at Gettysburg. They didn't arrive until the 2nd day, late in the afternoon of the 2nd day. But what's significant about the 6th Army Corps was how they got there. They were in a town called Manchester when they got the orders to march to Gettysburg. They covered the distance in approximately a day and a half of 35 miles. marching in July weather with all this gear on. Okay? They had one listed casualty for the Battle of Gettysburg, and the soldier was listed as missing. And the reason why he was listed as that, because when they took the roll call the day after the battle, he wasn't there, because he hadn't made it, because he fell out of the ranks. So he eventually showed up a few days later, but they never changed the listing of him being missing in action. We don't know, we've lost the history, the name of that soldier, but we do know he existed. So that's just a little history I wanted to give you about the 67th. Yes?
Just a question. What was the age group then, and then were they drafted or only volunteers?
Okay, so up until Gettysburg, or just after Gettysburg, they were all volunteers. Okay? The Union Army, if you will, the U.S. Army before the Civil War was at about 18,000 men, the entire Army. Okay, so obviously they needed more than that. So the initial push of the first 3 years, they were all volunteers. After Gettysburg, they put the draft in play. It didn't go very well at first for lots of reasons. You could buy your way out of the draft if you had enough money. You could also, and you could pay someone else to go into the Army for you in your place. Naturally, the people who couldn't afford to do that, okay, were not real thrilled. And you may or may not know of the New York draft riots that took place almost immediately after Gettysburg in New York City, okay, and they were very deadly. They lasted for 3 days, and there were a lot, and how they finally were put down was the 6th Army Corps, okay, again, because it had not been all that involved in Gettysburg, were marched to New York City to put down the riots. The 67th was not part of that group, but soldiers from their corps were sent to New York City to put down the draft riots. Yes, sir.
When you guys were lined up and the officer turned over command to the sergeant, the commander saluted this way and the sergeant, I've never seen a salute.
Yes, if you're carrying a rifle, they don't want you to go to the trouble of saluting with your right hand because your rifle is in your right hand. So because your rifle's in your right hand, and they don't want you to drop it, so if you're carrying the rifle, it's okay to do that. So it's basically a salute. Well, in the Civil War days, it would be your rifle.
And that's for junior officers only. So for a lieutenant or a captain, that's sufficient. But if you were to have a major or a general or even a colonel, you go to present arms.
Yes.
Question. This rifle, as you fire them, is just one shot?
One shot. That's
and then
correct.
you have to do all that? Oh my God.
Yes. Now the lieutenant didn't go into that. We were following his ready, aim, fire. Okay.
Yes.
Once you were in the heat of the battle, the commanding officer, the lieutenant or captain, whoever it was that was directing you, would tell you to independent fire or fire at will, which would allow you to fire at your own pace. Okay. And to keep firing until someone told you to stop firing. Any other questions? Sergeant, did you have anything more you want to say?
I'd like to take whatever he said a little bit further and answer the question. You know that in December 20th, 1860, the government of South Carolina convened and they voted to secede from the Union because of states' rights violations and some other baloney that took place up in Washington, D.C. They were followed by 6 other states on 1 January of 1861. So we have South Carolina, we have Georgia, Florida, we have Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then on 1 February 1861 we had Texas. So those are the original 7 states that seceded from the Union. All right, that was in 1 January and 1 February respectively of 1861. 4 months later, Fort Sumter was bombarded from Fort Moultrie by a Confederate general by the name of P.T.G. Beauregard, and because the fort surrendered eventually and Major Anderson, the CO, or the garrison commander, was allowed to leave with his garrison. And when that happened, when Fort Sumter surrendered, Abraham Lincoln, our president, sitting president, called in for 75,000 draftees. Okay, when that was announced, 4 more states seceded from the Union, namely North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia. Okay, so now we have 11. But if you look at the Confederate flag, it has 13 stars in the circle. What do the other 2 stars represent? They represent Missouri and Kentucky, because Missouri and Kentucky were border states, therefore they were slave states, therefore the South considered them belonging to the South. Therefore you have 2 additional stars on the Confederate national flag, also known as the Stars and Bars.
Interesting point. Fort Sumter was fought with no casualties during the actual bombardment. 1 casualty during the entire affair of Fort Sumter, and that happened the day that they surrendered and the Northern soldiers were allowed to leave the fort. Robert Anderson decided to have a ceremonial gunfire just to salute the soldiers that they had left. And during that ceremonial gunfire, one of the guns misfired and killed one of the soldiers manning the weapon. And that was the 1 casualty in the Fort Sumter.
3 more items I'd like to leave you with, very important. One of them will be testing how smart you are in terms of math. In November of 1863, President Lincoln moved from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery in Gettysburg. He gave a 2-minute speech. In that speech, he started by saying, 87 years ago, our forefathers, etc., etc. My question to you is, in terms of years, what is a score?
20 years.
Who says 20? You're absolutely right. Now, when we have school programs and we ask this to the school children, they all look at me, I don't know what a score is. This is Victorian language. We don't use that anymore, okay? So I explained to them, I says, when he said 87 years ago, take the 7 years, put it up here. Now you got 4 scores. You want to know how many? He says he's talking about forefathers, the founders of he's talking about 1776. So count forward. From 1776 to 1863 is 87 years, right? So you have that 7 up here, subtract that from the 87, leaves you 80, right? He says 4. 4 into 80 is 20. How many did I lose? Okay? So you know a score is 20 years. One other thing is the cemetery itself, the National Cemetery. All the graves are in a circle. Do you know why? They have this huge monument in the middle. And all the graves are all in a circle. Rows and rows of circles. That's because the Union line at Gettysburg never broke. It never broke.
It bended a lot.
It bent a lot because General Armistead actually tried to penetrate. He made it over the wall to what's nowadays called the high water mark. But he was driven back. Actually, he was mortally wounded doing that. Okay, so that's why you have all those grave markers in a circle. You also know that there is no Confederate soldier allowed to be buried in the U.S. National Cemetery. There are a few exceptions. Shiloh is one. And that's only they made an exception to that. Okay? He was a Medal of Honor winner. The Daughters of the Confederacy made it a point after the war to unbury or to dig up all the mass graves and reinter all those Confederate soldiers in various cemeteries. They try to send them back to the states that they came from. If they were unidentified, they put them in a mass grave. One of those mass graves cemetery is Covington, Manassas, Virginia. if you ever get to be that way. Two more items I want to leave you with, okay? You hear somebody talking about Civil War, you can tell whether he or she knows what they're talking about. But you have to listen. The Confederate Army calls a battle, they named battles, so did the North. They named it after a town that is either within the battlefield or nearby. Therefore, when you're talking about the Battle of Manassas, which is the first battle in April of 1861.
July.
In July, July of 1861. Manassas, that is Confederate. Or you're talking Bull Run, that's North, because the North names the battles after a creek or a brook that flows through the battlefield, or a river. The Battle of Antietam. Antietam is a creek. We're talking North. That's Northerner talking. The Battle of Sharpsburg, you know that's another Southerner talking, right? Because Sharpsburg is the town near Antietam Creek, where the battle took place. Okay, one more item, and then I'll let you go. The North names their armies after a river. Thus, the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the Ohio, the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Mississippi. The South names their armies after the state. Army of Tennessee, Army of Mississippi, okay? Army of Virginia, or Army of Northern Virginia, okay? Now you gotta listen to when whoever is talking about it. If he says that the Confederates, their Army of the Tennessee fought at Franklin, Tennessee, he doesn't know what he's talking about, because he named the Army of the Tennessee. That's a Northern Army, okay, if he's talking about the South. So you have to listen for that little TAG, that little word. The Army of the Tennessee as opposed to the Army of Tennessee. Got it? There'll be a quiz question later on. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you said earlier that the Confederacy added border states, Missouri and Kansas,
Kentucky.
and Kentucky to the flag, because they considered them part of the Confederacy.
Correct.
Did those states declare at that time?
No,
Or
those two
Confederacy
never.
just added
They
them?
were like Maryland. They were on the fence. They never went one way or the other. They never seceded from the Union, but yet they never declared allegiance to the South either.
And they sent soldiers to both armies. Both.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
One case in point, Antietam Creek Battle. We actually had, when you're talking about here about brother against brother, the 1st Maryland Regiment was actually facing the 1st Maryland. Two regiments facing each other in battle. One was south, one was north, because Maryland was also on the fence. They were partially pro-Southern, partially pro-Northern. Any other questions?